After 20 years, I finally saw my son again. But instead of joy, the first thing he said was he needed money. Money to save the very man who stole him from me, then disappeared without a word. They found me when they needed something, not when I was drowning, not when I was rebuilding my life from the ground up. Now that I have everything, they returned with nothing but demands. I wanted to turn my back. I had every right to. But what I chose to do next surprised even myself. He walked into the room like he belonged there. Pressed shirt, polished shoes, that same sharp jawline I remembered. He looked just like his father at that age, only colder. I had seen him around the building for the last few months, working in one of our compliance teams, introduced under a different last name. I never questioned it. I never let myself hope. But when he stepped into that boardroom that morning, stood in front of 30 executives, and looked straight at me, I knew. He was mine, and his first words shattered me. I need money. 500,000. He is dying. No greeting, no emotion. Just a request as calculated as a legal demand. The room fell silent. I could feel Helen's eyes on me from across the table, waiting for my cue. She had been my deputy for over a decade, a quiet force, sharp and loyal. But even she wasn't prepared for this. No one was. He continued speaking, calm, almost detached. Said he didn't want charity, just what was owed. Said his father needed urgent surgery, and without financial support, there was no chance of survival. I stared at him, at the lines around his mouth, at the pain he didn't hide, and the anger he didn't bother to explain. I had prepared myself for many things in life, but not this. Not my son, standing in my company, speaking to me like I was a stranger. I stood, slow, measured. The room watched, holding its breath. I said, "You're looking at the woman your father abandoned, the woman he left to rebuild her life alone, while he ran off with someone else and took my child with him." I said, "You're asking for help, not for you, but for the man who spent 2 decades pretending I never existed." He didn't flinch, just said, "I didn't come here to relive your past. I came here because you have what we need." The word we hung in the air. We. Him and the man who erased me. I had made my fortune through patience, precision, and strategy. I had learned not to react from emotion, but something in me cracked open. Not from rage, not even heartbreak. It was deeper than that. Like watching a movie of your own life, only the ending has been rewritten by someone else. I looked to the room, then to Helen, then back at him. I said, "Meeting adjourned." And I walked out. I could hear the murmurs behind me. Confused. Tense. Some people knew a version of my past. A whisper here, an old article there. But no one had seen the wound up close, until now. Back in my office, I shut the door and stood by the window. Boston stretched out beneath me, cold and grey and honest. My hands were steady, but my breath came shallow. He found me. And not because he missed me. He found me because they ran out of options. I leaned my hand on the glass and closed my eyes. I didn't want to be the woman who held grudges, but I also wasn't the same woman they left behind. They thought I'd still be that version, fragile, naive, grateful for crumbs. They had no idea who I had become. If you've ever been found again only when it was convenient for them, if you've ever had someone reappear at your door, not with love, but with conditions, you'll understand why I couldn't breathe in that moment. What would you have done? Would you have written the check? Or would you have walked away like I did? Of course, I didn't walk away for good. not yet. Because once I calmed my breath and opened my eyes, I remembered something. I was still holding the winning hand, and I hadn't even played my first card. By the time I closed the office door behind me, I had already made my decision. It wasn't an emotional one. It wasn't even personal. It was structural, calculated. Like all decisions that kept my company standing, my staff fed, and my name protected. I picked up the phone and called Helen. She answered before the first ring finished. I said, "Clear my calendar for the rest of the day, then notify the executive team. We're calling an emergency meeting, not tomorrow, in an hour. I want everyone in the main conference room, no exceptions." She didn't ask anything. She never did. That's why I trusted her. I stood by the window and looked out at the city again. I watched people walk briskly along the sidewalks, cars crawling in lunchtime traffic, a siren in the distance winding through the grey air. Life going on, always going on. But mine had just hit a line, not a pause, not a moment. A line. They crossed it, and now I would draw one back. At 1:15 sharp, I entered the conference room. The mood was different now, tighter. Everyone had heard enough whispers to know something was off, but not enough to understand the weight of what they were sitting in. Lucas was already seated. He didn't stand this time. He sat quietly, arms crossed, face unreadable. I walked to the front of the room and remained standing. I didn't need slides. I didn't need notes. All I needed was clarity. I said, "This morning, you witnessed a personal matter presented as a professional request. You were told that a sum of money was needed to assist with a private medical emergency. That request was made in a public forum, in my forum. There was no sound but breathing. I said, 20 years ago my son was taken from me, not by violence, not by law, but by manipulation. His father left our home, our marriage, and our life, and took our son with him. No custody battle, no negotiation, just a note on the kitchen counter and a silence that stretched into years. I looked across the table at Helen. She held my gaze for a moment, then looked down. I said, "I rebuilt my life alone. I built this company from scratch. Every legal strategy, every client we protected, every case we won. This place is not just my work. It is my name. Now that name has been used against me, not out of care, not even out of desperation, but out of entitlement." I turned to Lucas. "You don't get to walk back into my world and demand what was never yours to begin with. You may carry my blood, but you don't carry my truth. You've never asked it, never earned it, and you certainly didn't deserve to speak to me that way." He didn't blink. He didn't speak. I continued. "Your father may be dying, but what died in me happened a long time ago, and I buried it without your help. I carried every year of silence, every room I walked into alone, every newspaper article that mentioned his name without mine. I survived what he did to me, but I will not be made to fund his escape from the consequences of his own choices." A chair creaked in the corner. No one dared move more than that. I said, "This meeting isn't to make a decision. The decision was made the second I walked out of here this morning. There will be no check. There will be no favor. There will be no rescue." Lucas stood up. Not fast, not slow. He said nothing, just stared at me, then turned and walked out of the room. Not one person looked at him as he passed. I waited until the door closed behind him before I turned back to the others. I said, "Let this serve as a reminder. Who we are outside these walls will always find a way in. But inside these walls, we protect what we build. We don't let the past steal our future." Meeting dismissed. I left without another word. Back in my office, I sat down and let the silence settle in around me. I felt it in my chest, heavy and quiet. I thought maybe I would feel better, clearer, maybe even proud. I didn't. I felt cold, but I also felt certain. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty. It was the first real boundary I had drawn in 20 years, and it was mine to keep. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The air still held the hush of pre-commute silence, and the building hadn't yet filled with noise. The security guard at the front desk gave me a small nod, the same one he had given me for the last 10 years, steady and unreadable. I didn't stop to say good morning, not because I was cold, because I was focused. There was no room left for anything but precision. I went straight to the executive conference floor. Helen was already waiting. She had a stack of folders on the table and 2 cups of coffee, black, just how I liked it. She said, "I've prepared the briefing for the afternoon summit," and I included a media draft. I nodded, sat down, and reached for the folder. The media draft was short, deliberate. Just a few clean paragraphs acknowledging the events of the previous day, confirming the company would not be involved in any private financial matters, and reinforcing our commitment to leadership integrity and boundary transparency. It didn't name Lucas. It didn't name Harold. It didn't have to. The message was clear. We do not pay for silence. We do not reward betrayal. By noon, the media team had the statement queued, and at precisely 12:15, it went live. That same afternoon, I hosted our scheduled quarterly meeting with clients, stakeholders, and legal partners. Normally, it was a room filled with cautious optimism, polite nods, and practiced speeches. This time it felt different, sharper, more alert. They knew, or they had heard enough to guess. I took the podium, centered myself, and didn't waste time. I said, "There's something I need to clarify before we continue." The room went still. I said, "Recently, someone connected to me by blood used this company's platform to request financial support for a private matter." I paused. Long enough for the discomfort to rise, but not long enough to let it take over. I said, "That person is my son, and the request was for the benefit of the man who took him from me 2 decades ago." No gasps, just tension, unblinking attention. I continued. "When my son was 15, his father left. He left our home, our life, and our marriage, and took our child without a word. No negotiation, no goodbye, just gone. For 20 years, I never heard from them, not on holidays, not on birthdays, not when I lost my mother, not when I made my first million. They stayed gone. Until now. Until there was a need, a number, a dollar amount. I steadied my voice. This company was built on truth, on fairness, on the promise that justice starts at home. And I will not allow that foundation to be twisted for personal advantage. My decision not to provide the money is final, and it has nothing to do with cruelty. It has everything to do with boundaries." The room didn't applaud. That wasn't the point. But I saw eyes shift. I saw respect return. And I saw Helen, standing by the wall, her shoulders relaxed for the first time all week. After the meeting, I didn't linger. I returned to my office, closed the door, and waited. It didn't take long. By 5 o'clock, Lucas was standing in the doorway of my office. He looked different now, more tired, less sure. I didn't invite him in, but he came anyway. He stood in front of my desk and said, "So that's it. You aired everything out. Publicly." I kept my tone even. "That's not what I did. What I did was stop a dangerous lie before it spread further." He shook his head. You made me look weak. You made my father look like a villain. I looked him in the eye. I didn't have to make your father look like anything. He did that all by himself. His jaw tensed. And what about me? I stood up. You stood in front of my company and demanded money without ever once asking for truth. You spoke to me like a stranger, like a target. Not once did you ask what happened. Not once did you try to understand the version of the story you never got. He looked away. I continued. If you came back for connection, you would have knocked on my door quietly. You would have come without a price tag. But you came for money, and when I didn't hand it over, you made a scene. He said nothing. I stepped around my desk and stood beside him. I said, I spent 20 years building something out of nothing, out of grief, out of silence, out of being erased. I will not hand that over just because it's uncomfortable for you now. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He turned and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. I didn't chase him. Instead, I walked to the window, looked out at the skyline, and exhaled. This wasn't over. I knew that. But for the first time in years, I had made my stance known, and I hadn't even raised my voice. Not once. Only truth. And sometimes, that is louder than anything. 2 days after the summit, the first article came out. Not in a tabloid, not on a gossip site, but in the business section of the Boston Herald. Right below the fold. A photo of Harold from years ago, younger, sharper, still in the height of his charm. The headline was clean and quiet, but sharp. A man like him would understand the tone. Former investment advisor faces past, as family splits over legacy dispute. By noon, 5 more outlets had picked it up, some with less discretion. One used a photo of Lucas standing outside my office building, his face caught mid-blink, eyes heavy. It looked like shame or exhaustion. The article didn't distinguish. They never do. I didn't call Lucas. I didn't speak to the press. I didn't even alert my legal team. This wasn't a battle, not from my side. It was a consequence, and I had already drawn my line. What I didn't expect was the call from the hospital. A woman from the billing department, her tone clipped but practiced, asked if I was the listed emergency contact for Harold Caldwell. I told her I was not. She paused, then asked if I would be willing to speak about his financial situation. I said no. Then she told me what I already suspected. Harold's insurance policy had lapsed. His accounts were inactive. And the hospital was now considering a hold on treatment unless a payment plan was negotiated. She never said denied, but I could hear it in the shape of her voice. It was a slow decline in service, a quiet step back, a preparation to let the inevitable take over. After I hung up, I stood in my office for a long time. The quiet felt thick, not peaceful, not tense, just heavy. This wasn't how I imagined it ending for him, even after everything, even after what he took from me. But this was his road, one he paved, step by step, with every lie, every shortcut, every name he used that wasn't his. And now that road was closing behind him, leaving him stranded at the end. Helen knocked gently before entering. She said, "There's something you should see. It's not public. Yet. But it will be." She handed me a manila folder. Inside were scans, documents, a report from a closed case I hadn't thought about in years. A financial investigation that had quietly ended without charges, but not without damage. Harold had used my name, not mine directly, but a shell company that once linked to an address we shared during our marriage. He had tied that shell to a real estate development scam that tanked within months. Back then, I had assumed the paperwork had been cleaned up. Now I knew better. Helen said, "It's not enough to bring you down, but if it leaks, they'll tie you to it." I nodded slowly. She said, "I can talk to legal." I said, "No, not yet. Let it run its course." She hesitated, then left. The room felt smaller after she closed the door. Not suffocating, just narrower. Like the space around me had started tightening. By the end of the day, 2 journalists had called my assistant asking for comment. One even requested an interview about my response to Mr. Caldwell's medical and legal circumstances. I declined through official channels. Let the silence speak for itself. That night, I sat in the back seat of a black car, looking out over the Charles River as we drove past. The city lights bounced off the water, bright and fractured. I thought about Harold, about the way he used to laugh when he closed a deal, the way he once held Lucas's tiny hand like it was the only thing that mattered. Before he let go, before he let everything rot under the weight of his own ambition. I thought about what might happen next. The hospital hold, the public backlash, the social circles that once welcomed him now avoiding his name. The man who once walked into country clubs with confidence, now reduced to paperwork and billing calls. And Lucas, still caught in the middle, still hanging on to a version of his father that never really existed. In the morning, there was a letter waiting on my desk. It wasn't handwritten, just printed. A few short paragraphs. From Lucas. He said he understood now, that the silence was an answer in itself, that he wouldn't ask again. He said Harold wasn't doing well, that the doctors were scaling back intervention, that Lucas had sold his car to cover part of the bills, that the rest didn't matter anymore. At the bottom, one line stuck with me. "You don't owe him anything, but I thought you should know he keeps asking for you. Even now." I folded the letter and set it aside. Then I called Caroline. She answered with a sigh before saying anything. She always did that, like she knew every call from me carried weight. I said, "I need to meet, somewhere quiet." She said, "The lake house." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. 2 hours later, we sat across from each other, coffee cooling between us, no sugar, just bitter heat. I told her everything. The hospital, the shell company, the press, the letter. She listened. Caroline never interrupted. She let you bleed out every word before she spoke. When I finished, she said, "You've always been the one to clean up the mess. But this time, maybe let it fall." I said, "He's dying." She said, "So is trust. And sometimes it's not meant to be resuscitated." I didn't reply, because I didn't know what I believed anymore. I drove home that evening with the windows down. The air smelled like burnt leaves and something older, something I couldn't name. That night, I slept without dreaming, but I woke with a decision, not about Harold, not yet, but about the next step. If the past was coming for me, I would meet it fully awake. No denials, no edits, no shields. It was time to look directly at the damage and see who else had been hurt while I was trying to survive. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not Helen, not Caroline, not even the driver. I took my own car that morning, something I hadn't done in weeks. The weather was grey, quiet, the kind of sky that couldn't make up its mind between rain and fog. The air carried that familiar, metallic hospital chill even before I stepped through the glass doors. The woman at the front desk recognized the last name. Her eyes narrowed for a second, not out of judgment, more like recognition that came with caution. She pointed me toward the elevators without saying much else. The ICU floor always felt like the world on mute. Low beeping, footsteps softened by thick tile, and a steady hum of machines that barely sounded alive themselves. The nurse at the station looked up, nodded once, and then walked me to the door. She didn't ask for ID, didn't question why I came alone. She just placed her hand gently on the handle and said softly that he was stable, for now. When I stepped into the room, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. What I felt was something slower, heavier, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you've already fallen once, and the wind is just reminding you how far you've come since. Harold looked smaller than I remembered, not just thinner, but reduced. His shoulders curled inward. His face was sallow, skin papery and slack. His hands were limp against the blanket, and the edges of his fingers trembled with every breath the machine helped him take. He didn't see me at first. He was awake, just barely, eyes unfocused and drifting toward the ceiling. When he did notice someone had entered, it took him a few seconds longer to realize it was me. He didn't smile. He didn't try to speak, just blinked, slowly, as if I were part of some memory he wasn't sure he had earned back yet. I walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down. The room smelled like bleach and time. No flowers, no cards. Just a plastic cup of water on the tray and a clipboard of forms no one had signed. Neither of us spoke for a while. He didn't have the strength. I didn't have the need. Words, at that moment, felt like a formality we no longer owed each other. After a while, his lips moved. Barely, but I leaned in close enough to hear. He said, "You came." I didn't answer, because it wasn't a question. It was just a fact. Like rain falling or leaves turning, something that had simply happened. His breath hitched for a moment, and he grimaced slightly, the pain peeking through the medication. I watched him for a long time. I watched the rise and fall of his chest. I watched the way his eyes kept flickering toward me, then away, like he couldn't quite meet the version of me that now existed. The woman who survived without him. The woman he had underestimated, then ignored, then remembered only when his world ran out of exits. He whispered again, "I didn't mean for it to turn out like this." Still, I didn't answer, because anything I said would have been too clean, too final, and nothing about this was clean. He tried again. "I should have done better. With you. With him." There it was. The thing he had never said when he was strong, when he was proud, when he still believed the world bent in his favor. Now, at the end of it, those words came not with clarity, but desperation, not with courage, but surrender. I let the silence hold him, let it settle around the edges of the bed like a second blanket. Finally, I said, "You could have told him the truth. You had all those years, and you didn't." He closed his eyes. "I know." I said, "You let him grow up believing I left him. You let him hate me for something you did." His fingers twitched on the blanket. I could tell he wanted to respond, but he couldn't find the breath. Or maybe he couldn't find the right lie anymore. I stood and walked toward the window. The city stretched out beyond the glass, familiar and unchanged. I thought of Lucas, of that line in his letter. "He keeps asking for you," I said quietly. "He still doesn't know what you did with his name, with those loans, with the property transfer." Harold opened his eyes again, this time wide with fear. Not fear of death, fear of exposure, even now. I turned back to face him. I said, "You used him, and not just emotionally. You used him legally, financially. You signed papers under his name. You made him responsible for things he didn't understand." He tried to shake his head. but his body was too weak. I said, "You made me out to be the cold one, but I never used our son as a shield." His face twisted then, not in denial, but in shame. Real, visible shame. It took 30 years, but there it was, on his face. Not in the courtroom, not in an argument, but here, quiet, weak, honest. He mouthed something. I leaned in again. I was afraid. "You were always stronger than me." I stepped back. I said, "No, I just stayed when it got hard. You ran." He didn't answer. I sat down again, calmer now. He asked, barely audible, "Will you stay?" I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I stayed until the machine started clicking again, until the nurse came in to adjust his IV. Then I stood, placed a hand briefly on the edge of the bed, and walked out. Outside the room, I stood in the hallway and took one long breath. It wasn't closure. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was truth. And it was mine. 3 days after I left Harold's hospital room, I received a sealed envelope delivered by courier to my office. No return address, no note. Just my name printed in clean block letters on the front. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Lucas. I let the envelope sit on my desk for a full hour before opening it. I had learned over time not to let paper dictate my pace. Eventually, I slit the seal with a letter opener and slid the contents out. Inside were 3 things. First, a single-page typed letter from Lucas. Second, a photocopy of a property deed. Third, a scan of a loan agreement signed by Harold Caldwell and a co-signer. The letter was short. Lucas said he had started digging through old files, trying to untangle what he thought was personal history, and realizing much of it was something else entirely. He said the 2 documents attached were only part of what he found. He hadn't wanted to believe them at first, but once he traced the filings back through public records, there was no denying the truth. The deed had once belonged to a small commercial property outside Worcester. Nothing glamorous. A vacant retail space tied to a failed venture under one of Harold's side companies. It had been sold for a loss years ago, just after the market crash. But what struck me wasn't the sale. It was the name on the transfer, Lucas Caldwell, age 19 at the time. According to the filing, Lucas had gifted the property to Harold's holding group. There was a signature, no witness, no attorney on file, just a notary's stamp dated 2 days after Lucas's 19th birthday. The loan agreement told a similar story. A private lender, $75,000, same holding group, same timeline, same co-signer. Lucas. My stomach turned, not from shock, but from recognition. This was the piece I had always suspected, that Harold didn't just manipulate his son emotionally, but leveraged his identity, used the boy's legal access the moment he reached adulthood, built a shield of trust and blood to borrow money under someone else's future. I stood and walked to the window. My reflection stared back at me, older now, still composed, but with an edge of steel I hadn't had in my 30s. I picked up the phone and called Helen. When she answered, I said, "Pull the transaction records tied to Caldwell Holding Group between 2005 and 2010. I want every loan, every property transfer, every signature." She didn't ask why. She never did. An hour later, the files landed on my desk, and within 10 minutes of flipping through them, I saw what I had feared. Harold had used Lucas's name more than once, at least 5 times, all after his 18th birthday. No lawyers involved, no protections in place, just forged familiarity and the illusion of family. It wasn't illegal on the surface. Lucas had technically signed the papers, but the context was damning, and the implications were brutal. This wasn't just manipulation. It was financial sabotage dressed up as parental guidance. I called Caroline. She arrived at my home that evening with a folder already in hand. She always came prepared, as if the universe briefed her before I could speak. We sat on the patio, a blanket over our legs, the air still carrying that early spring chill. I handed her the documents without a word. She read them slowly, nodding once or twice, but saying nothing until she finished. Then she closed the folder and said, "This is coercion, masked as consent. It's not a crime on paper, but it's abuse in every other way." I asked, "Do we do anything with it?" She looked at me and said, "Only if he denies it. Otherwise, we let the truth sit where it is." Sometimes consequences don't need a courtroom. We sat for a while after that, not speaking, just watching the light fade from the trees. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking of Lucas at 19, probably eager to please, probably too loyal, probably unaware of what his father was asking him to give up. I saw myself in that, the younger version of me, the one who signed things in trust, the one who thought love and obligation were the same. And I saw Harold too, always one step ahead, always 10 steps away when things fell apart. The next morning, I sent Lucas a message. "Come by the house, no assistance, no security, just you and me." He showed up just after noon. He looked older than he had the week before, more tired, less defensive. We sat in the same room where Caroline and I had spoken. I handed him the file. He didn't open it, just nodded. He said, "I already know what's inside." I said, "Then tell me." He took a breath and said, "He told me it was a family strategy, that putting things under my name gave us options. I was too young to ask questions. I didn't know what it would mean later." I said, "And now?" He said, "Now I know he was planning an escape route, using me as the bridge." We sat in silence for a moment. Then I said, "You need to know none of this is your fault." He didn't cry, but his voice cracked when he said, "I think I hated the wrong parent. For too long." I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him he had every reason to be angry. I just said, "You have the truth now. That's more than most people get." He nodded, and for the first time, he looked at me not with expectation or resentment, but with something close to respect. Before he left, I asked him one more thing. I said, "What do you want to do with all this?" He said, "I want to make sure it ends with me. No more cycles, no more silence." He walked out the door a different man than the one who had arrived 2 weeks ago, and I stood there for a long time after, hand still on the knob, heart heavier than I expected. It wasn't closure, but it was something, a beginning, built from the wreckage of truth. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning, tucked into a routine weekly email. My executive assistant forwarded a strange notice from accounting. A dormant asset line had been accessed and reclassified without a formal request. That account had been inactive for over a decade, tied to a long-forgotten subsidiary from the early years of my company. On its own, it looked like an error. But my instincts had long learned that small glitches often pointed to deeper cracks. I didn't alert anyone. I simply told Helen to lock that account, trace the IP access, and flag any movement within the last 30 days. Within hours, a clearer picture emerged. There had been not just one, but 3 digital intrusions, all routed through an internal credential, all tied to Lucas's executive login. I sat in silence when the final report came in, because that name appeared again. Harold Caldwell. Not directly, but his old signature showed up on a backdated asset merger attempt. Someone was trying to merge one of our internal holdings back into an LLC bearing his name. The paperwork was disguised to look like part of a legacy real estate shuffle. The intention was clear. Harold, or someone acting on his behalf, wanted to attach his identity to a company I had spent my entire adult life building. That evening, I called Caroline. She arrived with her coat still on, sensing the urgency from my voice. I laid the documents out on the kitchen table, side by side like crime scene photos. She didn't speak for a long while. Then she said something I wasn't prepared for. This wasn't Lucas. I looked at her. She said, "He might have signed something. He might have been manipulated again. But this kind of maneuvering takes someone with legal knowledge and intent, someone who knows how to hide fingerprints inside the structure of a corporation." She flipped the final page and tapped her finger twice. This is Harold's playbook. Down to the timing, down to the shell names. He's not as weak as we thought. The rage that rose in my chest then wasn't hot or wild. It was cold, precise, controlled, like a blade being pulled slowly from its sheath. He had done it again, even from a hospital bed, even after all the truth had surfaced. He couldn't help himself. He had to take. One last time. Caroline said, "You have two options. Clean it up quietly, or make it public." I knew my answer before she finished speaking. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom. It was a quarterly meeting, full attendance mandatory. The executives gathered around the polished mahogany table, screens glowing, coffee poured. Lucas was already seated, stiff-backed and nervous. He could tell something was off. I didn't address him directly. Instead, I began with the documents, projected them onto the wall, explained line by line how our company had nearly been hijacked by a forged merger tied to an external party. I didn't name Harold yet. I let the silence stretch. Then I turned to the room and said, "The man behind this is someone who hasn't held any stake in our company for 30 years, someone who walked away from his responsibilities, someone who even now thinks he's entitled to a seat at this table." I pressed the remote again. The name appeared on screen. Harold Caldwell. Gasps rippled through the room. Lucas sank lower in his chair. I didn't stop. I said, "There's a reason I built this company under my name alone. There's a reason I never allowed outside capital to influence the board. I knew the world we came from. I knew what greed could do to bloodlines." I looked around the room, steady, measured. This is not just a corporate violation. This is personal theft disguised as business. Then I turned to Lucas, and I said, "And some of us have been caught in the middle of it." He looked up, stunned, but I didn't strike him. Not yet. Instead, I continued. "As of this morning, I have filed a full fraud disclosure with the Internal Audit Committee. A cease and desist has been sent to Harold Caldwell. Any further attempt to touch this company will be met with litigation. We will pursue damages, both reputational and financial. And we will name him publicly if he does not comply." The room was silent. Lucas stood up then, slowly. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "Maybe you didn't, but you signed something. Again, and it nearly cost this company everything." His face fell, not from embarrassment, from recognition, from the slow horror of realizing he had once again been used. I dismissed the board. The meeting was over. The message was clear. That evening I received a message, a short text from a nurse at the hospital. Harold's condition had worsened. They were moving him to a private unit. I didn't respond. The next morning, Lucas came to my home. This time, he didn't ask to come in. He stood on the porch, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slumped. He said, I let him in, not just into the company, into my head. I didn't say anything. He said, I need to do something that doesn't involve fixing what he broke. I nodded once. Then he handed me a signed statement, a full confession. Every document he had unwittingly signed, every communication, every trace. He was ready to testify if needed. I looked at him. He said, I don't want his legacy. I want to build something real, even if it takes the rest of my life. Then he turned and walked away. That night, I sat alone in my study, papers spread across the desk, and I allowed myself to breathe. The war wasn't over, but the weapon had been disarmed, and the silence that followed felt like peace, for the first time in 30 years. 3 days later, the subpoena arrived at the hospital. It wasn't delivered in silence. It was escorted by 2 officers and a clerk from the county courthouse. They stood at the nurses' station outside Harold's private room, and though they remained professional, their presence turned heads. I didn't have to witness it to know the weight of that moment. The staff would whisper. The word fraud would travel down corridors faster than the gurneys. But that was only the beginning. I had spent the last 48 hours with Caroline and 2 other attorneys. We prepared everything. The cease and desist had failed to yield a response. Harold, through his lawyer, had ignored our final warning. And while Lucas's signed statement had exonerated him in the eyes of our board, it was still evidence in a much larger scheme. One Harold orchestrated from a hospital bed, relying on sympathy and silence. But I had already given enough silence to that man in this lifetime. The lawsuit included 3 counts: attempted corporate theft, wire fraud through false signatures, and defamation through false narrative. Because yes, part of our case involved the way he'd systematically tried to damage my reputation with Lucas for over 20 years. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about exposure. I wanted a record. I wanted a court transcript. I wanted a legal document that would sit in the same system that once failed to protect me. Caroline made sure of it. The moment the subpoena hit the hospital room, we moved to freeze any remaining accounts tied to Harold's trust. There wasn't much left. His girlfriend from years ago, now apparently gone from his life, had already drained most of it. But the paper trail still mattered. It told a story, one of decline, of hubris, of a man who couldn't let go of what he abandoned. By midweek, local business press had picked up the story, not by name, not yet. But the headline was enough. Former spouse of leading real estate founder under legal review for attempted fraud. It didn't take long for readers to connect the dots. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in our city knew which woman had built her fortune from a single duplex near the train station and turned it into a property empire. The first call came from the mayor's office, then the Chamber of Commerce, then a journalist I hadn't spoken to in 10 years. I refused interviews. I let the documents speak for themselves. Meanwhile, Lucas disappeared. I didn't mean that in the dramatic sense. He still showed up to work, still attended meetings, still followed every protocol. But his eyes looked lower, his voice softer. He was unraveling from the inside, quietly. As if part of him had finally accepted the truth, not just about his father, but about the version of his life he had been told. That Saturday, I found him sitting in the break room after hours, alone, staring out the window. I said nothing at first, just sat across from him and waited. He finally said, I didn't think it would come to this. I said, it always was. We just refused to see it for what it was. He nodded. I said, your name's clean. The investigation made that clear. You're not being pursued. He said, I know, but I still feel like I was part of it. I looked at him. Then stop being part of it. Do something with your name that isn't tied to his. He looked up. I continued. This company can survive anything, but I'm not going to let it absorb your father's legacy. You decide what comes next. Then I left him with that. The following Monday, he handed me a proposal. Not a resignation, but a shift. He wanted to move out of operations and into social impact. He wanted to start a housing program under the company's wing, aimed at supporting displaced single mothers and elderly women. It would be managed separately. Transparent books, independent audit. He'd take a pay cut. He wanted to earn his place, not inherit one. I approved it the next day, and then that night, I returned to the hospital. It was quiet, late enough that most visitors had gone. I didn't go inside the room. I just stood at the glass and looked at Harold, surrounded by wires and slow dripping IV bags. The man who once left with our son and never looked back, now reduced to a frail outline. He saw me through the glass. He didn't smile. He didn't gesture. He just stared. And I stared back. For the first time in years, we were in complete agreement. No words, no lies, no power plays, just truth and distance. The nurse beside me whispered, "He won't talk to anyone. Barely eats, barely moves." I nodded and walked away. That week, the court processed the initial hearing date. My attorneys handled the logistics. I stayed out of the details. The important part had already happened. The moment he was served. The moment he realized I wasn't that quiet woman he left behind anymore. The city had changed. The company had changed. I had changed. And now, there was a paper trail to prove it. I returned home that evening, poured myself a glass of wine, and looked out across the dark lawn where I had built my first property from the ground up. I remembered the years I spent hiding from shame, avoiding public places, shrinking beneath his legacy. Now, his legacy had been unmasked. And for the first time, I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity. There was more to come. But I no longer needed to be afraid of the past catching up to me, because I had already outrun it. And now I was turning back, not to run from it, but to face it, fully armed. Not with vengeance, but with truth. By the time Friday arrived, the balance of power had shifted in ways no one could ignore. What began as a personal confrontation was now public record. The press had grown more aggressive. Harold's name was officially attached to the fraud charges after the clerk's office confirmed the court filing. The damage was no longer quiet, and it wasn't reversible. I sat at the long boardroom table, where I had once defended our expansion plan, to a room full of doubters. Now, those same faces turned to me not with skepticism, but with anticipation. They had seen what I was capable of when pushed, and now they wanted to know what I would do next. I didn't waste time. I said, "Today isn't about damage control. We've already contained that. It's about defining what this company stands for now that the dust has settled." Silence. But the kind that listens, not questions. I continued. For years, my name has carried weight. Not just because I built something profitable, but because I built it clean. Every property deal, every zoning battle, every contractor negotiation, clean. That changes now if we let it. The story that's being told out there, in the press, in our industry, in small circles behind closed doors, if we don't shape it, it'll shape us. That's when I slid the folder across the table. Inside were the plans for the new foundation. Not a sideline initiative, not a vanity project. An officially chartered arm of our company, to be funded by a one-time restructuring of executive bonuses and 3% of annual profit. Its purpose: shelter grants, legal support for displaced elderly women, and recovery programs for women left behind after family abandonment. No names were attached, no backstory, just mission and infrastructure. Helen passed out copies to each board member. I said, "We are not just building properties, we are rebuilding dignity, starting with those who were once written off, forgotten, abandoned, like I was." A pause. I kept my voice steady. This isn't charity. This is clarity. If my past is going to be dragged into the spotlight, then I will not cower from it. I will turn it into policy. And if anyone in this room thinks this is sentimental or weak, they are welcome to resign before lunch. Nobody moved, not even to breathe. The vote passed unanimously. By that afternoon, the announcement was already drafted for the press. It was strategic, timed, no mention of Harold. Just a bold new chapter for the company, a shift toward legacy and restoration. It was everything I never thought I'd live to say. And yet it felt overdue. But the moment that marked the true turning point came not in the boardroom, not in the papers. It came later that evening when I received a call from Lucas. He didn't say much, just that he'd made a decision and he hoped I would be present when he announced it. I agreed. Saturday came with the kind of cold that seeps into your joints. I wore my wool coat and sat quietly in the back of the employee gathering. The main conference hall was repurposed for the occasion. Decorations were minimal. Lucas didn't like spectacle. He stood at the front, flanked by two project managers from the new foundation. His voice was clear. He said, "For a long time, I believed a version of my family that was fed to me in half-truths. I believed strength looked like distance. That silence meant power. That my father was always right because he never asked for forgiveness." He paused. "But I've learned that real strength is admitting when you were used. It's facing the people you failed. And it's rebuilding trust, not because you're owed a second chance, but because you choose to earn it." He looked directly at me, then turned back to the crowd. "So today, I'm stepping down from my current role. I'm dedicating the next 3 years fully to the foundation, not as an executive, not with a title, just as someone who knows what it's like to carry the shame of a broken family and wants to make sure no one else has to carry it alone." A quiet wave of claps followed, not thunderous, just respectful. He didn't look proud. He looked relieved. That night, I sat alone in my den, fire burning low, a single glass of bourbon in my hand. I wasn't celebrating. I was remembering. Remembering the day Harold left with Lucas in tow, the sound of the door shutting, the finality of footsteps fading down the walk, and the years after, when I had to force myself not to hope for a knock that never came. And now, after all that time, I realized something. It wasn't the lawsuit that turned the tide. It wasn't the boardroom decisions or the press coverage or even the foundation. It was the moment my son stopped being his father's son and started being his own man. That was the real justice. And no court filing could deliver that. But I could witness it. And for the first time in decades, that felt like enough. I didn't win. I didn't get revenge. But I reclaimed something far more enduring: control, direction, peace. And as I blew out the candle beside me and stood to go to bed, I felt lighter. Not because the past had vanished, but because I had finally stopped letting it lead me. The morning after Lucas's speech, the office felt different. Not quieter. There was still the usual background of phones, keyboards, coffee machines. But something had shifted underneath it all, a new kind of energy. Not rushed, not tense, just clean. I arrived earlier than usual, not to oversee anything, but because my body woke me before the sun and wouldn't let me rest. I took it as a sign. In my private office, I found a letter on my desk. The envelope was unsealed. My name written in Lucas's handwriting, steady and unhurried. I sat down and opened it, already bracing myself without knowing why. It read, "Mum, I could have said this to your face, but I wouldn't have finished it without falling apart. So here it is, without interruption. I never hated you. I think I convinced myself I did, because it made things easier. It was easier to be angry than to feel the emptiness of not knowing you. Dad told me what he needed to tell me so I wouldn't ask more. And I didn't. I swallowed his version whole and lived on it for years. But that version is paper thin now, and it doesn't hold up anymore. What you did, surviving, building, standing up in front of people who once dismissed you and telling them who you were without apology, that wasn't for revenge. That was for you. And I see that now. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not offering excuses. I'm just saying I see you. Thank you for not slamming the door when I showed up asking for money. Thank you for showing me who I could become, even when I came as someone you barely recognized. Love, Lucas." I read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it inside the desk drawer, where I kept only a few things: my mother's locket, the deed to my first commercial property, and a photograph of Lucas at 5, before everything changed. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't moved, but because the letter didn't break me. It steadied me. There was still one thing left unresolved: Harold. He had been quiet since the legal fallout. His name was no longer just a stain in private. His former associates had cut ties. Whatever savings he might have tucked away were now under audit. He was no longer seen as a man with connections or pull, just a man with bills and a broken liver. I didn't have to see him. No one expected me to. But one part of me needed to close that door for good, and not by locking it. So that afternoon, I called the hospital. By evening, I stood at the edge of his room, watching him sleep. His skin had thinned. He looked smaller than I remembered, his jaw slack, worn, not like a villain, just like a man at the edge of his story. He didn't wake up immediately. I didn't say his name. I sat, listened to the machine beep at regular intervals, let the silence stretch until he stirred. When he opened his eyes, he blinked twice before recognition set in. He said, "So you came." I nodded. I didn't need to say anything else. He turned his face away as if ashamed. "It's all gone, you know. Every last bit. They drained me dry, those people I trusted. Funny how quick they vanished when the money did." I waited. I never meant for it to be like that. With you. I was stupid, arrogant. I thought I'd build something new, but it crumbled faster than I could lie about it. I watched him, the man who once told me I was holding him back, that he needed something fresher, lighter, easier. The man who took my son like luggage and didn't look back. He said, "I'm not asking you to fix this. I just wanted to say it before it's too late." I leaned forward, voice low but firm. "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here because I'm done carrying it." The silence, the resentment, the questions. "I'm not offering you forgiveness because you asked. I'm offering it because I refuse to let your failure follow me to the grave." He didn't argue. He just closed his eyes. And for the first time since I had known him, Harold looked like he had finally run out of words. When I stood up to leave, he opened his eyes again. He said, "Lucas came. Last week. Sat right there." That didn't surprise me. "He's stronger than you think," I told him. "He didn't get it from you." He tried to smile, It was barely there. When I walked out of that room, the air outside felt sharper, not colder, clearer. I didn't walk away as a woman triumphant, not as a victim either. I walked away free. That night, I sat at my kitchen table. No bourbon, just tea. Lucas had texted me a simple message. I read it. Thank you. He didn't need to say what he read. The trust I'd placed in him had already taken root, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to win to be whole. I just had to choose what I carried and what I let go. Letting go of Harold wasn't surrender. It was finally ending the conversation that had haunted my silence for 2 decades. And in that quiet, I made peace with the sound of my own breath. Still, present, unafraid. The sun poured through the wide glass windows of the main hall. Outside, the garden was being prepped for the company's 50th anniversary gala. Staff moved quietly and efficiently, arranging tables, checking floral deliveries, testing lights. It had been a long time coming, but this was not just a celebration of business. Not to me. It was the closing of a long, jagged circle. 2 weeks had passed since I visited Harold. He passed away 4 days after I saw him. Peacefully, they said. The hospital called me, but there were no legal ties left. His will, sparse and recent, named no heirs. Just instructions for a simple cremation. I paid for it. Not out of obligation, but out of mercy. And mercy, I was learning, didn't always have to come with emotion. Lucas had shown up to the hospital 2 days before the end. They spoke again, privately. I didn't ask what was said. I wouldn't ask. There was a new maturity in Lucas now, a calmness that hadn't been there before. He walked with less anger, less apology. This morning, I stood before a table in my office, looking down at a stack of papers. My legal counsel had spent months preparing them. Everything had already been signed. But today, I would say it out loud, in front of everyone, the public announcement. I stepped onto the stage precisely at noon, not a moment before. The staff, shareholders, press partners, and long-time clients had all gathered. It wasn't a massive crowd, but it was the right one. Lucas stood to one side. He didn't need to be center stage. He had learned what real strength looked like. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it looked like letting others speak first. I looked at the crowd, at the faces who once never saw me as more than the quiet woman behind the founding CEO. Some of them had forgotten how I'd kept the company alive in its leanest years. Others had underestimated the discipline behind my silence. That was about to change. I spoke with clarity. I built this company not for profit, but for purpose. After 50 years, I believe that purpose has changed, and so has my role in it. There were subtle movements in the crowd, curious glances, raised brows. I continued. Starting today, all shares held under my name will be transferred into the Stonebridge Women's Resilience Trust. This trust will operate independently, providing grants, legal aid, and business education for women over 50 who are navigating separation, widowhood, or financial displacement. I paused. No one moved. Many of these women, like I once was, are told they are past their prime, that they are no longer useful, that they should shrink and fade. Not anymore. A silence held the room in place. Even the press didn't move. Not a camera clicked. Not a foot shuffled. I looked toward Lucas, then back at the room. I am stepping down as chairwoman. Effective immediately, Lucas Alden will take over the operational oversight of the foundation and act as transitional steward of this company until a full succession board is appointed. He has earned that trust. There it was, public, sharp, unmistakable. No inheritance behind closed doors, no sudden appointments, no favors handed out. Just a firm declaration of where the legacy would go and who it would serve. There were no claps at first, just silence. Then someone started, then another, then the room joined. Not explosive, not performative, but grounded, real. After the applause faded, I stepped down from the stage, walked past the crowd, and returned to the garden where the wind moved gently through the white cloth of the tents. Lucas followed me. He didn't say much, just stood beside me. That was enough. Later that evening, when the event had ended and the guests had trickled out, I walked alone through the now quiet hall. The lights had dimmed, the flowers were still fragrant, still soft. I passed by a large frame that held a photo from 30 years ago, back when Harold was at the peak of his charm, back when Lucas was a boy, standing awkwardly between us. I didn't stop. I walked right past it, out into the evening air, where my car waited under the canopy of trees. The sky above was streaked with colour, orange and purple hues melting into dusk. That night, I slept soundly. For the first time in decades, my dreams didn't pull me backward, because I had finally said it. All of it. And I didn't whisper it in private. I said it in the open, under lights, in front of every voice that had once tried to speak over me. And then I gave it all away. Not for revenge, not for show, but because I finally understood that legacy has nothing to do with control. It's about setting others free to rise on their own. I had been waiting years to stop surviving. Now, I was ready to live. It had been 3 weeks since the announcement, since I stood in front of everyone and said out loud what had lived in my bones for too long, that I was done with the past, that I was done with keeping it all in. And now, in the stillness of my lakeside cabin, I felt what I didn't know I had been waiting for. Silence. Not the heavy, awkward kind that used to fill the house after a fight. Not the silence that came from swallowing my voice, just to keep peace. This was different. It was the kind that felt like release, like the world was no longer pressing down on my chest, like I could finally breathe without thinking about who might hold it against me. The lake shimmered outside the glass windows. Trees swayed gently. Inside, the fire cracked with a softness that reminded me of my younger days, before the betrayal, before the departures, before I became a woman defined by what had been taken from her. I sat with a book I didn't read, tea I didn't drink, thoughts I didn't chase. My body was resting, but my mind was alert in the best way. Not anxious, just awake. Lucas came up for the weekend. He didn't bring luggage, just a bottle of wine and the same quiet expression he had carried ever since Harold passed. We didn't speak much. He chopped wood. I made soup. We sat on the porch. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic reconciliations, just the presence of two people learning how to be with each other, honestly, without the weight of obligation. He asked if I was okay. I told him I wasn't sure what that meant anymore, but I smiled when I said it, and he understood. Later, as we stood by the fire pit under a sky full of stars, he finally said what had been sitting between us for too long. He said he had hated me for years, because he thought I gave up on him. And I said I understood, because I had hated myself too, for not fighting harder, for letting Harold win, for not being loud enough, strong enough, brave enough. He looked down, and then he said, maybe we had both survived the only way we knew how. That moment didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years, but it softened something. And sometimes that is more healing than any apology could offer. The next morning, he left early. He had work to do. And I had something else in mind. I drove back to the city, not to the office, not to my old life, but to a small community centre near the industrial district, a place I had been quietly funding for years. Today, I wanted to show up in person. I met with the women there, women who were starting over. Some had escaped abusive marriages. Others had been left bankrupt by partners who had run. Some were just older and invisible. I sat with them. I listened. And then I told them my story. Not the version people saw in magazines or interviews, but the real one. The nights I cried on the kitchen floor. The days I worked 3 jobs to build back what was stolen. The years I kept my head down because I didn't know how to raise my voice. They didn't interrupt. They didn't pity. They nodded. Some wept. And then one of them stood up and said I had given them something more valuable than money. I had given them proof that healing was not only possible, but powerful. I left that day with a heart fuller than it had ever been, not because I had given something, but because I had taken something back, myself. No more looking for closure in the people who broke me, no more waiting for apologies that would never come, no more defining my story by what others had done. I wasn't just healed, I was free, and I planned to stay that way. If this story reminded you of something you've lived through, you are not alone. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones we trusted the deepest. But healing doesn't wait for their apology. It begins the moment we take our power back. If this touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story matters, and someone out there might need to hear it.